A single silver rose under glass, a frozen echo of the past. Will the silence break when enmity turns into magnetic tension and the fragile vacuum of duty shatters into 1,000 jagged shards of passion? We are about to hear this story right now. The rain did not merely fall against the high-arched windows of the minister's office. It besieged the glass in relentless, drumming waves. It was a dark, bruised Tuesday evening in late November, the kind of night where the dampness seeped through the thick stone walls of the Ministry of Magic and settled deep into the marrow. Inside the cavernous room, the only light came from the shivering flames of enchanted beeswax candles floating near the ceiling and the heavy, ambient glow of the fireplace. Hermione Granger sat behind the massive mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a thickly bound report. The tooth of old parchment felt rough beneath her skin, a grounding sensation amidst the suffocating atmospheric pressure that had taken residence in the room the moment the heavy oak doors had clicked shut. She did not look up immediately. She couldn't. She needed a fraction of a second more to steel herself against the static that now hummed in the air, a low-frequency vibration that always accompanied his presence. Draco Malfoy stood on the opposite side of her desk. He was a portrait of rigid, aristocratic austerity, draped in charcoal robes that absorbed the dim light rather than reflecting it. As the newly appointed head of the Department of Magical Inspection, he was, technically, her subordinate. In reality, the dynamic between them was a tangled, deeply buried knot of unspoken history and lingering shadows. The revised protocols for the aura integration, Draco said, his voice a low, smooth drawl that carried no warmth, only the crisp efficiency of a blade slicing through silk. He placed a leather-bound folder on the edge of her desk. The movement was precise, controlled. Hermione watched his hand retreat. She noted the stark contrast of his pale skin against the dark leather, the sharp, elegant lines of his knuckles, and the bite of a silver signet ring against the flesh of his right index finger. There was a time when those hands had been defined by a desperate, panicked tremor. Now they were steady, exuding a chilling competence that made Hermione's chest tighten. She finally lifted her gaze to meet his. His eyes were the color of the storm raging outside the enchanted windows, a turbulent, impenetrable grey. "You've flagged Clause 4, Hermione observed, her voice deliberately steady, though her fingers betrayed her by compulsively straightening the already perfect lace cuff of her sleeve. It was an old tell, one she despised, but could never quite suppress when the air grew this heavy. "The inspection parameters are standard, Malfoy. We discussed this in the Wizengamot chamber last week." "We discussed the theory of the parameters, Minister," Draco replied, the formal title slipping from his lips like a polished stone. "The practical application, as I have outlined in the margin notes, leaves the inspection teams vulnerable to bureaucratic loopholes. I will not authorize my department to operate under guidelines that allow suspects to delay audits." Hermione inhaled slowly, the scent of ozone and bitter ink filling her lungs. It was the scent of a magical duel, distilled into the suffocating arena of paperwork and politics. He was pushing her, testing the boundaries of her authority with a relentless, punishing meticulousness. Every interaction they had was a masterclass in tactile friction, a brushing of sharp edges that left invisible, stinging cuts on them both. "I will review your notes," she said, her tone carrying the finality of a gavel striking wood. She pulled the folder closer to her chest, effectively ending the professional portion of the evening. Draco did not move to leave. The silence stretched between them, thick and fraught, expanding to fill the shadows of the expansive office. The drumming of the rain seemed to magnify, echoing the rapid, uneven beat of Hermione's heart. She prided herself on being impenetrable, a beacon of strength for the post-war wizarding world. But around him, her armor always felt precariously thin, susceptible to the magnetic pull of a past they both vehemently ignored. He was staring at her, his expression a carefully constructed mask of indifference. Yet Hermione, who had spent years learning to read the microscopic shifts in his demeanor, saw the minute tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible swallow. He was fighting a war behind those storm cloud eyes, a silent battle of attrition that left him emotionally hollowed out, even as he projected absolute control. "Is there something else, Head Auror?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave, slipping from the authoritative cadence of the minister into something quieter, something dangerously close to an inquiry between two people who shared too many ghosts. Draco's gaze flickered, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. The white of his knuckles showed briefly as he gripped the silver head of his cane, a pure affectation, a shield he carried to keep the world at bay. "No," he said sharply, the word clipped, designed to sever the fragile thread of tension connecting them. "I expect your amendments by Thursday." He turned on his heel. The sweep of his robes disturbed the air, sending a wave of that cold, sharp ozone scent washing over her. Hermione exhaled a shaky breath as he walked toward the door, listening to the hollow echo of his footsteps against the polished stone floor. She closed her eyes, preparing to submerge herself back into the safety of her paperwork. But the footsteps stopped. The sudden cessation of sound was louder than a thunderclap. Hermione opened her eyes. Draco was standing halfway to the door, perfectly still. He was not looking back at her. His head was turned toward the deep alcove on the eastern wall of her office, a space reserved for personal artifacts, small tokens that grounded her amidst the crushing weight of her position. Hermione's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, painful catch. She knew exactly what he was looking at. There, resting on a pedestal of dark mahogany, was a cylindrical glass flask, sealed with intricate, shimmering runic wards. Inside the vacuum of the enchanted glass, perfectly preserved, suspended in an eternal state of twilight bloom, was a single, silver-tipped rose. The atmospheric pressure in the room plummeted, leaving behind a ringing, deafening silence. The professional distance, the bureaucratic hostility, the years of carefully maintained avoidance, all of it evaporated in an instant, replaced by a visceral alignment of past and present that hit with devastating force. 8th year. A dusty corridor near the astronomy tower. A mocking comment that died on his lips, replaced by a gesture so wildly out of character, so agonizingly vulnerable, that Hermione had spent a decade trying to convince herself it had been a cruel joke. He had shoved the flower into her hands, his eyes blazing with a desperate, terrified fire, before fleeing into the shadows. She had preserved it that very night, trapping the fleeting moment in unbreakable glass. Draco stood frozen, From her desk, Hermione could see the rigid line of his back, the way his shoulders had gone completely taut under the fine wool of his robes. The cane in his hand trembled, just once, a violent, involuntary tremor that betrayed the absolute collapse of his internal fortress. He was staring at the rose. He was staring at the physical manifestation of a boy's broken, desperate plea for forgiveness, sitting proudly on the shelf of the Minister for Magic. Hermione slowly pushed her chair back, the scrape of wood against stone cutting through the tension. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to bridge the sudden, terrifying chasm that had opened between them. She watched the way his chest rose and fell in a sharp, shallow breath. The guilt, the deep, suffocating remorse that he wore like a second skin, was practically radiating off him, filling the room with a bitter, heavy sorrow. He thought she kept it as a trophy of his humiliation. She knew he did. She could see it in the defensive posture of his spine. He didn't know that she looked at it when the crushing loneliness of her life became too much to bear. He didn't know it was the only thing that gave her hope. Draco, she whispered. The name tasted unfamiliar and intimate, slipping out before she could lock it behind her teeth. The sound of his given name seemed to break the spell. The tremor stopped. The rigid posture returned, snapping back into place like a physical blow. Draco did not look at her. He didn't dare. If he looked at her now, with the memory of that silver rose burning between them, the last remnants of his control would shatter. Without a single word, without a backward glance, he resumed his path to the door. His strides were longer now, faster, driven by a desperate need to escape the room, to escape her, to escape the undeniable, damning proof that the past they had both tried to bury was sitting, perfectly preserved, in the open air. The heavy oak door opened and closed with a dull, final thud. Hermione was left alone in the dim light of the candles, the sound of the rain rushing back to fill the void he left behind. She stared at the closed door, her heart hammering against her ribs, her fingers pressing into the old parchment of the folder he had left. The static in the air remained, thick and unresolved, buzzing with the knowledge that the carefully constructed wall between them had just sustained its first irreparable crack. The oppressive glare of the Lumos orbs suspended above the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's conference table offered no shadows to hide in. It was a sterile, unforgiving light that bleached the warmth from the heavy mahogany wood and illuminated every exhausted line on the faces of the department heads gathered around it. But for Hermione, the biting chill in the room had nothing to do with the magical lighting and everything to do with the glacial presence seated directly across from her. 3 days had passed since the rain-lashed evening in her office. 3 days since the fragile, agonizing silence that had stretched between them when his eyes had locked onto the glass flask holding the silver-tipped rose. If Hermione had harbored any fleeting hope that the discovery of that preserved artifact might soften the jagged edges between them, Draco Malfoy was currently dismantling that illusion with surgical, brutal precision. The budgetary allocation for the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office is, frankly, an exercise in reckless sentimentality. Draco's voice cut through the stagnant air of the room. He did not raise his tone. He didn't need to. The quiet, lethal cadence commanded absolute silence from the rest of the committee. He flicked his wand, a sharp, minimalist gesture, and a thick sheaf of parchment duplicated itself, shooting across the polished table to land squarely in front of Hermione. The heavy scent of bitter ink and sealing wax wafted up from the freshly printed runes. "I have audited their expenditures for the past 3 quarters," Draco continued, his eyes fixed on the parchment, refusing to lift his gaze to hers. "They are operating at a deficit, funneling galleons into rehabilitation programs that yield a success rate of barely 12%. It is a drain on ministry resources, Minister." Hermione's spine stiffened against the high back of her chair. She felt the sudden, frantic need to smooth the lapels of her charcoal blazer, her fingers twitching before she forced them to interlock tightly on the table. The atmospheric pressure in the room had plummeted the moment he began his systematic dissection of her policies. "Those rehabilitation programs," Hermione started, her voice meticulously measured to hide the sudden tightness in her throat, "are designed to integrate heavily cursed artifacts safely, rather than simply incinerating them and risking residual magical fallout in populated areas. The success rate is a reflection of the complexity of the curses, not the incompetence of the department. Efficiency does not account for the complexity of the curse, Minister. Only the end result," he countered instantly. He finally looked up. The visceral impact of his gaze made her breath catch, a sharp intake of air that tasted faintly of ozone and impending hexes. The storm cloud grey of his eyes was entirely devoid of the trembling vulnerability she had witnessed 3 nights ago. Instead, they were encased in solid, impenetrable ice. He had spent the last 72 hours rebuilding the towering fortress around himself, and now he was manning the parapets, pouring boiling oil on the only person who had ever seen the cracks in the stone. He was punishing her. More accurately, he was punishing himself, projecting his internal terror outward into bureaucratic hostility. The sight of that rose had exhumed a ghost he had spent a decade suffocating beneath layers of pure-blood stoicism and ministry regulations. His defense against the paralyzing fear of exposure was a ruthless, biting cold. He needed to prove to her and to himself that he was untouchable. "I am implementing an immediate sanction on their discretionary funds," Draco stated, leaning forward slightly. The movement brought the lapels of his immaculate black robes into stark relief against the rigid white of his collar. The bite of his silver signet ring flashed under the lumos orbs as he pressed his fingertips against the edge of the table. "Until they can prove a 30% increase in operational efficiency, their budget is entirely frozen." A murmur of genuine unease rippled through the other department heads. It was a draconian measure, an overt, aggressive challenge to her administrative authority right in front of her subordinates. "You are overstepping your mandate, Head Aura," Hermione said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. The air between them hummed with heavy, oppressive static. It wasn't just a disagreement over galleons and sickles. It was a tactile friction of wills, a desperate push and pull masked beneath the dry language of parliamentary procedure. "My mandate, Minister, is to ensure the security and operational integrity of this government," Draco replied, the formal title snapping from his lips like a whip. "A mandate I execute without the encumbrance of bleeding heart idealism." Hermione's jaw tightened until her back teeth ached. She reached for the parchment he had sent her, pulling it closer. Her eyes scanned the dense, cramped script. His handwriting. It was elegant, sharp, and entirely uncompromising. The margins were filled with red ink, slashing through her carefully constructed proposals with aggressive, jagged strokes. She knew exactly the game he was playing. The tentative approach in her office, the whispered sound of his first name, it had terrified him to his core. So, he was initiating a violent repulsion. He was manufacturing a professional chasm so wide and treacherous that neither of them could ever hope to cross it. He wanted her to hate him again. It was safer that way. "I will not approve a freeze that cripples an active investigative branch," Hermione stated, lifting her chin to meet his icy stare head-on. She channeled every ounce of her deeply ingrained stubbornness, refusing to let him bully his way out of his own emotional panic. "You will revise these sanctions, Malfoy. You will find a compromise that enforces oversight without dismantling the department entirely." Draco's expression remained entirely impassive, carved from marble, but Hermione's eyes dropped instinctively to his hands. His knuckles, pressing against the dark wood of the table, were bone white. The physical strain of maintaining his detached facade was warring violently against his rigid posture. A solitary drop of ink from his self-inking quill splattered onto the parchment beneath his hand, betraying a microscopic tremor he could not completely suppress. "There is no compromise with inefficiency," he said quietly, the words devoid of inflection. "Then you will learn to find one," she fired back, the command ringing with absolute, unyielding finality in the silent room. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. The rest of the committee seemed to hold their collective breath, caught in the crossfire of a magnetic pull so intense it warped the very oxygen in the room. The Lumos orbs above them flickered, the ambient magic in the chamber destabilizing under the sheer force of their suppressed hostility. There were two opposing poles, vibrating with a tense energy that masked a deeply buried, terrifying gravity. Draco's jaw ticked, a minuscule betraying movement. He slowly withdrew his hands from the table, breaking the invisible electric tether that bound their gazes together. "As you command, Minister," he murmured. The words were perfectly obedient, yet laced with a subtle, bitter venom that stung worse than an outright refusal. He stood up. The scraping of his chair against the stone floor echoed with a hollow finality in the tense silence. He gathered his leather folio with crisp, mechanical movements, his face a completely unreadable mask of aristocratic disdain. "If there is nothing else," Draco said, addressing the room at large but looking at absolutely no one, "I have a department to run." He didn't wait for a formal dismissal. He turned and strode toward the heavy double doors, his black robes billowing in his wake, leaving behind a profound drop in temperature and the lingering metallic scent of ozone that always accompanied his strongest magic. Hermione watched the heavy oak doors swing shut behind him, the dull thud resonating in the pit of her stomach. The committee members slowly began to shuffle their papers and murmur again, the spell of tension finally breaking, but Hermione heard none of it. She looked down at the parchment in front of her, staring at the ruthless red slashes of his ink. Her fingers ghosted over the parchment's rough tooth, tracing the violent, jagged lines he had drawn. He was fighting her with everything he had, utilizing every weapon in his bureaucratic arsenal to push her away, to prove to her that he was exactly the cold, unfeeling monster the world believed him to be. But Hermione closed her eyes, the phantom image of his white-knuckled grip burning vividly in her mind. She knew the truth. The harder he pushed, the more terrified he was of the pull. The coldness was nothing but a fragile shield, and beneath the armor, she knew, he was slowly bleeding out. Level 10 of the Ministry of Magic did not care for the passage of time. Deep beneath the bustling administrative floors, the subterranean archives existed in a perpetual, breathless midnight. Here, the air was thick and undisturbed, heavily laden with the scent of decaying leather, dried binding glue, and the metallic tang of ancient, dormant magic. The only light emanated from a sparse network of floating, charmed candles that cast long, trembling shadows across the endless aisles of towering iron bookshelves. It was 2:15 in the morning. The absolute silence of the vacant corridors pressed against the eardrums, an immense atmospheric pressure that isolated the two occupants of Section 4 from the rest of the wizarding world. Hermione Granger stood halfway up a groaning, rolling wooden ladder, her fingers blindly tracing the spines of crumbling legal tomes. She was searching for a highly specific, obscure 14th century precedent regarding magical audit exemptions. The only compromise that could untangle the bureaucratic knot Draco had mercilessly tied around her department 3 days prior. The exhaustion in her bones was a physical ache. The immaculate charcoal blazer of the Minister for Magic had been discarded hours ago, draped haphazardly over a reading chair. The cuffs of her white silk blouse were unfastened and rolled to her elbows, the pristine fabric now smudged with centuries-old dust. She reached higher, the muscles in her back protesting, desperately willing her blurred vision to focus on the faded gold lettering of a heavy, iron-bound ledger. Below her, seated at a long oak reading table, was Draco Malfoy. The late hour and the sheer, crushing weight of their mutual fatigue had achieved what no political mediation could. It had stripped away their armor. The rigid, aristocratic head of inspection was entirely absent. His outer robes were gone. His slate-grey waistcoat was unbuttoned, and the starched collar of his shirt hung open at the throat. The silk cravat loosened and pulled askew. He was leaning forward, his elbows braced on the table, massaging his temples with long, pale fingers. The biting cold he had weaponized in the boardroom had evaporated in the subterranean damp. In its place was a heavy, intoxicating static, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the narrow space between the bookshelves and the reading table. Hermione's fingertips finally found the coarse, raised leather of the ledger she needed. She gripped the heavy spine and pulled, but the ancient book was wedged tightly between its neighbors. With a frustrated, exhausted breath, she tugged harder. The tome gave way abruptly, the sudden release of friction sending a shower of fine silver dust cascading into the dim air. The sheer weight of the iron-clasped book dragged Hermione's arm down. The ladder wobbled, emitting a sharp, hollow echo that shattered the silence. She let out a soft, involuntary gasp, her grip slipping on the decaying leather. Before the heavy tome could plummet to the stone floor, a shadow detached itself from the reading table. The rush of displaced air carried the subtle, distinct scent of cedar, bergamot, and a faint trace of ozone. Draco was suddenly there, standing at the base of the ladder. He reached up, his hands closing over the bottom half of the ledger, entirely arresting its fall. Hermione froze. Her breath caught violently in her chest, trapped by the sudden, overwhelming proximity. Because his hands had not just caught the book, his long fingers had wrapped directly over hers. The tactile friction of his skin against hers was a shock to her system, a jolt of raw, unadulterated magical electricity that bypassed her exhaustion entirely. He was warm. Beneath the cool, impassive exterior he projected to the world, the skin of his palms was startlingly, achingly warm. The heavy silver signet ring on his index finger pressed a cool, hard bite against the delicate bones of her knuckles. Neither of them moved. The heavy iron ledger was suspended between them, a physical anchor in a moment that felt entirely untethered from reality. Hermione looked down. Draco's face was angled upward, illuminated by the flickering golden light of a floating candle drifting just past his shoulder. The defensive, impenetrable ice that usually guarded his storm-cloud eyes was completely gone. In the dim, dust-moted air, his gaze was remarkably open, stripped raw by fatigue and the sudden, visceral alignment of their magic. He was looking at her, not as the minister, not as a rival, but with a quiet, desperate intensity that made the blood roar in her ears. She watched his eyes track the bruised purple shadows beneath her lower lashes, the slight, involuntary parting of her lips, the stray curl of hair that had escaped her usually immaculate chignon to cling to her damp cheek. For a terrifying, endless second, the magnetic pull between them was so absolute it threatened to drag her off the ladder entirely. The space between them ceased to exist, filled instead by the heavy, shared rhythm of their uneven breathing. Draco's throat worked in a slow, agonizing swallow. Slowly, deliberately, he absorbed the weight of the book, allowing Hermione to slide her trembling hands out from beneath his. "I have it," he murmured. His voice was a ruined, raspy whisper that scraped against the quiet of the archives, devoid of its usual aristocratic drawl. Hermione nodded, unable to trust her voice. She carefully descended the ladder, her legs feeling strangely hollow. When her low-heeled shoes met the stone floor, she was still standing too close to him. She didn't step back. The frantic, deeply ingrained instinct to straighten her cuffs flared up, but her hands remained at her sides, heavy and useless. Draco turned and carried the ledger to the reading table, setting it down softly on the scarred wood. He didn't return to his chair. He remained standing by the edge of the table, his head bowed slightly as he undid the rusted iron clasps. The metal gave way with a harsh, grating squeal. Hermione stepped up beside him. The physical distance between their shoulders was less than an inch. She could feel the heat radiating from him in the damp chill of the subterranean room. She leaned over the open book, her eyes scanning the dense, archaic Latin script, though the words blurred into meaningless shapes. "The third paragraph," Hermione breathed, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the charmed candles. She pointed a trembling finger toward the middle of the brittle, yellowed page. "The precedent for auditing exemptions regarding artifacts of volatile classification." Draco leaned in. The shift in his stance closed the final fraction of an inch between them. The side of his arm brushed against hers, a fleeting, phantom touch of linen against silk. He didn't pull away. The hostility of the past 3 days melted into the floorboards, leaving behind a profound, terrifying vulnerability. Draco lowered his head, his pale blonde hair catching the candlelight as he read the lines she had indicated. Hermione turned her face slightly, her gaze abandoning the text to trace the sharp, elegant line of his jaw. She saw the faint, silvery scar near his collarbone, exposed by the open neck of his shirt. As Draco reached out to trace a line of the Latin text, his hand hovered over the parchment. Hermione's eyes fell to his outstretched fingers. The tremor was undeniable. It wasn't the violent, panicked shaking of his youth, but a fine, suppressed vibration betraying the immense, crushing effort it took for him to maintain his composure while standing this close to her. The guilt he carried, the silent, agonizing devotion he had locked away inside a glass flask, was vibrating right through his skin. Without thinking, driven by an instinct older than their rivalry and deeper than their pride, Hermione lowered her hand. She let the side of her palm rest gently against the edge of the heavy oak table, the tip of her little finger brushing against the side of his trembling hand. It was the lightest of touches, barely a whisper of contact. Draco's breath hitched. The tremor in his hand instantly ceased, shocking into stillness at her touch. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted entirely, transforming from an isolating void into a warm, heavy cocoon. He didn't look up at her. He kept his eyes locked blindly on the 14th century parchment. But he slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifted his hand a fraction of an inch to the left, leaning the side of his hand fully against hers. They stood there in the profound silence of the archives, surrounded by the dust of dead centuries, reading words neither of them could comprehend. Stripped of their titles, their defensive anger, and the bitter ghosts of their past, they were just two exhausted souls seeking anchor in the dark. The cold had finally broken, surrendering to a quiet, desperately fragile warmth, holding them captive in a breathless, static pause. The morning light bleeding through the high-arched windows of the minister's office was not the gentle, diffuse glow of a new dawn. It was brittle, sharp, and utterly unforgiving, casting harsh geometric shadows across the expanse of Hermione Granger's mahogany desk. The rain from earlier in the week had been replaced by a biting frost that patterned the glass with crystalline webs, trapping the warmth inside, but allowing the bitter winter chill to seep through the ancient stone masonry. But the drop in temperature had nothing to do with the weather outside. It radiated entirely from the crumpled, ink-stained pages of the Daily Prophet, lying dead center on her blotter. Hermione sat frozen, the coarse grain of the cheap newsprint biting into the pads of her fingers. The acidic, metallic scent of the enchanted ink filled her lungs, a noxious fume that turned her stomach. The headlines screamed in bold, moving type: Puppets in the Ministry, Inspection Department, Vendetta traced to Malfoy Manor. Beneath the sensationalist banner, a venomous article detailed an anonymous leak from within the Wizengamot. The parchment alleged that the recent aggressive audits crippling the minister's progressive departments were not the impartial work of the head of magical inspection. Instead, it painted a damning picture of a shadow campaign, orchestrated by none other than Lucius Malfoy, pulling the strings of his heir from the comfortable exile of his Wiltshire estate. A sickening, heavy static began to hum at the base of Hermione's skull. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, trying to force away the sudden, violent intrusion of memory. The drawing room of Malfoy Manor, the suffocating terror, the sneer of pure-blood supremacy. For 10 years, She had fought tooth and nail to build a government founded on merit and transparency, burying her trauma beneath layers of legislation and sheer, unyielding willpower. And yet, looking at the black and white photograph of Lucius Malfoy, smiling a cold, imperious smile from the page, the old fear rose like bile. The heavy oak door to her office clicked open without a preliminary knock. The atmospheric pressure in the room immediately shifted, thickening with the familiar, unmistakable signature of his magic. The scent of bergamot, cedar, and a faint trace of ozone preceded him. Hermione dropped her hands, her spine snapping completely rigid against the back of her leather chair. Draco Malfoy stepped over the threshold. He was dressed in immaculate, severe black robes that absorbed the harsh morning light. His posture was the picture of aristocratic perfection, yet as he closed the door behind him, Hermione's eyes instinctively darted to his hands. They were unburdened by files or reports today. His long, pale fingers rested lightly on the silver serpentine head of his walking cane. Just 3 nights ago, in the breathless, suffocating dark of the subterranean archives, those same hands had been stripped of their armor. She remembered the shocking, visceral heat of his palm against hers, the fine, suppressed tremor of a man fighting a desperate battle against his own devotion. She remembered the profound, fragile truce that had bloomed in the space of a shared breath over a 14th century ledger. Draco walked toward her desk, the hollow echo of his footsteps ringing sharply against the polished stone floor. As he approached, the magnetic pull that always existed between them flared to life, a desperate, tactile friction that tugged at the edges of her resolve. He stopped a few feet away, his storm cloud eyes scanning her face. For a fraction of a second, the impenetrable ice that usually guarded his expression was absent. There was a tentative, almost imperceptible softening in his jaw, a quiet question lingering in the grey depths of his gaze. He was remembering the archives too. He was waiting to see if the fragile bridge they had accidentally built in the dark would survive the harsh light of day. Then, his gaze dropped to the desk. He saw the Daily Prophet. He saw his father's face. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying to behold. The tentative warmth vanished, sucked out of the room into a vacuum of absolute freezing nothingness. The muscle in Draco's jaw feathered, snapping tight. The knuckles of his right hand, resting on the silver cane, turned instantly, violently bone-white. The bite of the silver signet ring pressed so deeply into his flesh that it looked as though it might draw blood. "I assume," Draco began, his voice a lethal, silken whisper that scraped against the frigid air. "This is the reason my scheduled briefing with the Aura office was abruptly cancelled by your undersecretary." Hermione stood up. The movement was defensive, driven by a frantic need to equalize the power dynamic in the room. Her fingers twitched, immediately seeking the pristine edge of her blazer's lapel, smoothing the fabric with a desperate, jerky motion before she forced her hands to drop to the desk. "Is it true, Malfoy?" she asked. The words tore from her throat before she could filter them through the measured diplomacy of her office. They were raw, laced with the bitter poison of the article and the ghosts of a war she could not quite escape. Draco did not flinch, but the stillness that overtook him was more alarming than any physical recoil. It was the stillness of a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the detonation. Is what true, Minister? He countered, the formal title returning, wielding it like a jagged shield between them. That I am a mindless extension of my father's prejudices. That my entire career, my department, my every action within these walls is nothing but a grand orchestrated conspiracy to unseat the mudblood minister? The slur, even used rhetorically, hung in the air like suspended, shattered glass. The static in the room escalated into a deafening roar. "Don't do that," Hermione snapped, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and a sudden, terrible panic. "Don't put words in my mouth. I am asking you a direct question about the integrity of your audits. The leak claims that the targets of your sanctions align perfectly with Lucius's remaining political rivals and my own key initiatives. I need to know if your department's autonomy has been compromised." "You need to know," Draco repeated slowly, the syllables dripping with a corrosive, bitter acid. He took a half-step closer to the desk. The metallic tang of ozone grew overwhelming, a physical manifestation of his deeply suppressed, chaotic magic. He had spent the last 10 years bleeding for this government. He had worked 80-hour weeks, buried himself in the most dangerous, thankless dregs of magical law enforcement, and subjected himself to endless scrutiny, all to scrub the dark mark stained from his family's name. He had built his reputation on unyielding, ruthless impartiality. He had done it to be worthy, to atone, to look at the glass flask in her alcove and know he was no longer the coward who had given it to her. And yet, in the space of a single morning, entirely fueled by a piece of cheap newsprint, she was looking at him with the exact same suspicion, the exact same defensive terror that she had worn in their youth. "You believe it," Draco stated. It wasn't a question. It was a bleak, devastating realization. "I didn't say that," Hermione argued, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She was losing control of the interrogation, losing control of herself. The logic and intellect that defined her were being drowned out by the visceral panic of betrayal. "I am asking for your assurance, Draco. I am asking you to tell me that he isn't influencing you, that you aren't using the inspection department to finish the war he started." The sound of his given name, which had been a whispered plea in the rain and a silent comfort in the archives, was now weaponized. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. Draco's eyes, normally a storm cloud grey, hardened into chips of fractured flint. The devastating hurt in his chest, a wound so deep and profound it threatened to cleave him in two, was instantly locked away behind an impenetrable fortress of pure, biting ice. If she wanted a monster, if she needed him to be the villain in her narrative so she could feel safe, he would not deny her. He was far too proud and far too broken to beg for her trust. "My department operates strictly within the parameters of the law, Minister," Draco said, his voice entirely devoid of human emotion. It was the voice of an automaton, a perfectly calibrated machine of bureaucratic hostility. "My audits are based on numerical deficits and operational failures. If your initiatives are failing, it is due to your own administrative incompetence, not a phantom conspiracy brewed in my father's drawing room." Hermione gasped softly, the cruelty of the statement landing like a slap. "Malfoy!" "If you believe my integrity is compromised," he cut her off, his tone slicing through the air with surgical precision, You have the authority to initiate a full Wizengamot inquiry. Until you formalize those charges, I will not stand here and defend my honor against the paranoid delusions of a minister who cannot separate the prophet's gossip from reality. He didn't wait for her response. The tactile friction, the magnetic pull, the fragile, terrifying warmth they had shared. It was all completely obliterated, frozen over by a betrayal of faith that neither of them knew how to survive. Draco turned on his heel. The sweep of his black robes disturbed the stagnant, freezing air. He walked toward the heavy oak door, his posture rigid, his shoulders carrying the crushing weight of a guilt that was no longer just his own. "Draco, wait!" Hermione called out, her voice cracking, suddenly realizing the catastrophic error she had just made. The fear evaporated, leaving behind a sudden, hollow desperation. She had let the past dictate the present. She had looked at the man who had silently caught her fall in the dark and accused him of pushing her. He did not stop. He did not look back. His hand clamped around the brass handle of the door. The white of his knuckles stood out starkly against the metal. He pulled the door open and stepped out into the bustling corridor, disappearing into the sea of ministry officials without a single backward glance. The heavy door clicked shut, the dull thud echoing with a devastating finality. Hermione was left standing alone behind her massive desk, the cold from the frosted windows finally sinking deep into her bones. She looked down at the newspaper, the acidic scent of the ink mocking her. The silence in the room was absolute, a crushing, suffocating weight. The fragile tether that had connected them, woven from silver petals and unspoken longing, had just been violently severed. And as the icy reality of his absence settled over the office, Hermione knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had been the one to hold the blade. The iron gates of Malfoy Manor did not screech. They parted with a silent, spectral grace, acknowledging the minister's magical signature with a reluctant shimmer of ancient wards. Hermione stepped onto the gravel path, her breath hitching as the freezing night air bit at her lungs. Above, the moon was a sliver of bone-white light, casting long skeletal shadows across the manicured grounds. She shouldn't have come. Every instinct of political self-preservation screamed at her to turn back, to return to the safety of her fire-warmed office and the comforting weight of legislative scrolls. But the hollow ache in her chest, the echo of the look in Draco's eyes when she had accused him of treachery, was a physical weight she could no longer carry. The silence in the ministry had become a tomb, and she was the one who had rolled the stone into place. The manor loomed ahead, a monolith of grey stone and dark history. Hermione bypassed the main entrance, her feet instinctively leading her toward the rear of the estate. She remembered the blueprints from the post-war restoration audits, the sprawling glass houses that sat like a crown of crystal on the edge of the dark forest. As she rounded the corner of the stone terrace, the scent hit her first. It wasn't the damp, earthy smell of a typical English winter. It was a heavy, intoxicating perfume, a floral sweetness so concentrated it felt like a physical pressure against her skin. It was the scent of summer trapped in a cage of glass. The great conservatory rose out of the mist, its panes glowing with a soft, ethereal luminescence from within. Hermione reached the heavy brass handles of the doors. Her fingers trembled, the bite of the cold metal grounding her. She pushed. The transition was violent. One moment she was in the freezing, sterile grip of December. The next, she was submerged in a humid, tropical heat that made her vision swim. The air was thick, moist, and vibrant with a hum of high-level herbological charms. Hermione stepped onto the moss-covered stone path, her boots sinking slightly into the verdant carpet. She stripped off her heavy travelling cloak, letting it fall unheeded to a bench. Beneath her silk blouse, her skin instantly dampened. The atmospheric pressure here was different. It was alive, charged with a magnetic pull that drew her deeper into the labyrinth of greenery. She walked past ferns that breathed and vines that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, but her eyes were searching for something specific. She turned a corner near a fountain carved from white marble, and the world simply stopped. Row upon row of raised stone beds stretched out before her, bathed in the silver glow of floating moon spheres. In them grew hundreds, thousands of roses. But they were not the crimson or gold varieties favoured by the wizarding elite. These were the roses from her office. The petals were a deep, velvety charcoal, tipped with a shimmering, iridescent silver that caught the light like liquid mercury. They were a miracle of magical crossbreeding, a variety that shouldn't exist in nature. Yet here they were, thriving in a silent, secret sea of devotion. Hermione's knees felt weak. She reached out, her fingers ghosting over a nearby bloom. The texture was like the finest suede, the silver edge cool to the touch despite the greenhouse heat. This wasn't a hobby. This was a sanctuary. Every rose was a silent testament, a physical manifestation of a decade of unspoken longing. He had not just given her a flower in their 8th year. He had spent the rest of his life cultivating the memory of that moment. The soil requires a specific mineral balance, a voice rasped from the shadows. And the light must be filtered through crushed moonstone. They are temperamental. They don't survive well in the open air. Hermione spun around. Draco was standing near a potting bench at the far end of the aisle. He had discarded his formal robes. He wore only a white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows to reveal the lean, corded muscles of his forearms. His hair was damp, clinging to his forehead, and his eyes, the storm cloud grey she had seen turn to ice that morning, were now dark, hollowed out by a profound, weary sadness. The tactile friction between them ignited instantly. It was a roar of static in the humid air, a visceral alignment that made the very leaves of the roses tremble. Draco, she breathed, the name a jagged, broken sound in the stillness. He didn't move toward her. He stayed behind the safety of the workbench, his hands gripping the edge until his knuckles turned that familiar, agonizing white. The silver signet ring caught the moon glow, a sharp spark in the green gloom. "Why are you here, Hermione?" he asked. The use of her name was not an invitation. It was a demand for an ending. "Have you brought the auras to search the soil for hidden dark artifacts? Or perhaps you've come to personally oversee the dismantling of my father's supposed shadow cabinet?" The bitterness in his voice was a physical blow, but Hermione didn't flinch this time. She took a step toward him, her shoes silent on the moss. "I came because I was wrong," she said, her voice steadying as the truth of the room settled into her soul. "I looked at a piece of parchment and let it blind me to the man standing right in front of me. I looked at the past, because it was easier than facing the terrifying reality of what you've actually become to me. Draco's jaw worked, a sharp, rhythmic tick. He looked away, his gaze falling to the sea of silver-tipped roses. And what am I, Minister? A curiosity? A reformed villain for your collection? A boy who once threw a rose at you because he didn't have the words to say he was drowning? You're the man who caught my fall in the archives, she countered, moving closer, ignoring the frantic warning of her own heart. You're the man who has spent 10 years working to be better than the world told him he could be. And you're the man who grew all of this. She gestured to the glass house, the motion encompassing the years of silent work, the meticulous care, the hidden garden of his heart. Draco finally looked at her. The ice was gone, shattered completely, leaving behind a raw, bleeding vulnerability that was almost too much to witness. He looked like the boy in the corridor again, terrified, desperate, and entirely at her mercy. I didn't grow them for you to see, he whispered, his voice cracking. I grew them because I couldn't stop, because every time I tried to move on, to be the person my name demanded, I would remember the way you held that single flower. I would remember that for 1 second you didn't look at me with disgust. He let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded more like a sob. I am a Malfoy, Hermione. We are built on foundations of rot and pride. I thought if I could just make one thing that was beautiful, one thing that didn't have a sting or a curse attached to it, maybe I could live with the rest of it. The atmospheric pressure in the greenhouse peaked. The magnetic pull was no longer a suggestion. It was an imperative. Hermione bypassed the workbench, stepping into his space. The heat from his body was a physical force, radiating through the thin linen of his shirt. She saw the tremor in his hands. It was violent now, a shaking he could no longer suppress. Without a word, she reached out and caught his wrists. The contact was a lightning strike. Draco gasped, his head falling back as if he'd been struck. Her skin was cool from the night air. His was burning with the fever of the conservatory. The friction of her palms against his pulse points sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated magic through them both. You're not rot, Draco, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, low murmur. She squeezed his wrists, forcing him to look at her. And you're not your father. You are the man who grew a forest of hope in the middle of a graveyard. Do you have any idea how brave that is? Draco's eyes searched hers, desperate for a lie he could use to push her away, but he found none. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the heavy, rhythmic thud of two hearts finally beating in sync. He slowly turned his hands within her grip, his fingers interlacing with hers. The bite of his silver ring pressed against her skin, no longer a barrier, but a bridge. He leaned down, his forehead coming to rest against hers. The scent of the roses was all-encompassing now, a velvet shroud that isolated them from the rest of the world. I'm terrified, he whispered against her skin, the confession falling into the space between them like a bared blade. If I let this happen, Hermione, if I let you stay, I won't survive losing you again. Then don't lose me, she replied, her breath ghosting over his lips. Stop fighting the pull, Draco. Just for once, let yourself be found. In the silver light of the glass house, surrounded by a decade of silent devotion, the last of the cold finally surrendered. The tension that had defined their lives for 10 years began to melt, leaving behind a raw, pulsing warmth that neither of them was prepared for, but both were desperate to claim. The air in the conservatory was no longer just humid. It was thick with the weight of years of unsaid things, vibrating with a static so intense it felt as though the glass panes might shatter from the internal pressure. Hermione did not pull away. Her fingers remained interlaced with his, the contrast of her warm, slightly smaller hands against his long, pale, trembling fingers, creating a visceral alignment that grounded them both in the present. Draco's breath was shallow, hitching in the back of his throat as he kept his forehead pressed against hers. The scent of the silver-tipped roses was an intoxicating velvet shroud, blurring the lines between the minister and the inspector, the hero and the redeemed. For a moment, the external plot, the ministry audits, the Daily Prophet headlines, the ghost of Lucius Malfoy, evaporated, leaving only the magnetic pull of two souls finally admitting to the gravity that had governed them for a decade. "You don't understand," Draco whispered, his voice a ragged edge of silk and glass. He finally pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his grey gaze searching hers with a desperate, frantic intensity. "I built this garden as a penance. Every rose was a prayer I didn't think I had the right to speak. I didn't build it for a happy ending, Hermione. I built it because I couldn't breathe without knowing there was something pure left of the way I felt about you." He let go of one of her hands, his palm coming up to hover just inches from her cheek. He didn't touch her yet. The anticipation was a tactile friction in the air, a stinging sweetness that made Hermione's heart hammer against her ribs. "I am stained," he continued, the words falling like heavy stones into the silence. "My name is a curse. My father is a shadow that I can never fully step out of. And you? You are the light of this world. If I reach out and take what I want, I'll pull you into the dark with me. I'll ruin the one thing I ever managed to love." Hermione felt the familiar surge of frustration, but it was tempered now by a profound, aching empathy. She saw the whitening of his knuckles as he fought the urge to close the distance. She saw the way his eyes tracked the movement of her lips, a silent, starving hunger that he was trying to starve back into submission. "You talk about ruin as if you aren't the one who has spent 10 years rebuilding," Hermione said, her voice dropping to a fierce, low murmur. She leaned into the space he had created, refusing to let him retreat into his self-imposed martyrdom. "You talk about the dark as if you aren't standing in a room full of silver light that you created. Stop looking for reasons to be the villain in a story I've already finished reading, Draco." She reached up, her fingers closing over the wrist of the hand hovering near her face. She pulled his palm flush against her cheek. The contact was an explosion of sensory detail. The bite of his silver signet ring was cold against her temple, but his palm was burning, a feverish heat that seeped into her skin. His thumb ghosted over her cheekbone, the texture of his skin slightly calloused from years of tending to his magical thorns. The tremor in his hand intensified for a second before smoothing out into a heavy, possessive stillness. Draco let out a sound, a broken, jagged groan that was half surrender and half agony. The last of his aristocratic composure disintegrated. He stepped into her, his other arm wrapping around her waist with a sudden, desperate strength, pulling her flush against the linen of his shirt. The visceral impact of their bodies meeting sent a jolt through the room. Hermione's hands flew to his chest, her fingers bunching the fabric of his shirt, feeling the frantic, uneven thud of his heart beneath the ribs. The atmosphere in the greenhouse peaked. The floating moon spheres flared with a sudden, brilliant silver light, reflecting the surge of raw magic between them. For a heartbeat, they were perfectly aligned. The tension was no longer a barrier, it was a bridge. But as the first light of a winter dawn began to bleed through the frosted glass of the conservatory, turning the silver-tipped roses into pale ghosts, Draco's grip suddenly tightened, then went slack. The realization of the world outside, the world that would judge her for being here, the world that would never let a Malfoy forget, rushed back into him like a freezing tide. He pulled back, his hands dropping from her as if she were made of white-hot iron. "No," he gasped, the word a sharp, sudden repulsion. He turned away from her, his back rigid, his breath coming in jagged bursts. I can't do this to you. By morning, the rumors of you coming here will be everywhere. I won't be the reason they tear you down, Hermione. I won't be your downfall." "Draco, look at me," she commanded, her voice trembling with the sudden, jarring shift from warmth to cold. "Go," he said, his voice regaining that terrifying mechanical detachment she had heard in her office. He began to pace the narrow, mossy path, his movements erratic, the scent of ozone rising again as his magic flared in response to his internal chaos. "Leave the roses. Leave the memory. You have a world to lead, and I have a name to bury. We were never meant to be more than a mistake in a corridor." The coldness he projected was a weapon, but Hermione could see the way his shoulders were shaking. He was trying to save her by destroying himself. The emotional seesaw had swung back with a violent, punishing force, threatening to undo everything they had just touched. "You coward," she whispered, the word cutting through the humid air like a hex. Draco stopped. He didn't turn around, but she saw the way his knuckles turned bone white as he gripped the edge of a stone planter. "You think this is noble?" she continued, her voice rising with a desperate, stinging heat. "You think pushing me away into the light while you rot in this beautiful glass cage is what I want? You're not saving me, Draco. You're just choosing the fear over the hope. Again." "I am choosing your survival," he roared, finally spinning to face her. His face was a mask of tormented fury, his eyes blazing with a silver fire that matched the roses around them. "I would rather have you hate me from the safety of your ministry than have you love me while the world burns you at the stake for it." The silence that followed was deafening. The atmospheric pressure in the room was so high it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out. They stood 10 feet apart, two poles of a dying star, vibrating with a tension that was rapidly becoming unbearable. Hermione didn't argue. She didn't use her logic. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the broken, beautiful man who was so convinced of his own unworthiness that he was willing to kill the only thing that made him feel alive. "Fine," she said, her voice suddenly terrifyingly quiet. "If you want to be the martyr, be the martyr. But I won't play the part of the damsel you've decided to save." She turned and grabbed her cloak from the bench, the heavy fabric snapping in the air. She didn't look back as she walked toward the heavy brass doors of the conservatory. She didn't see the way Draco reached out a hand toward her. his fingers curling into a hollow fist as he watched her go, the silence of the garden closing in around him like a tomb. The transition back to the freezing night air was a physical shock, but the cold inside her was worse. As the iron gates of the manor closed behind her with a dull, final thud, Hermione knew the final shift was coming. She wasn't going to let him hide anymore. If he wouldn't come into the light, she would bring the light to him, even if she had to break the world to do it. The minister's office had never felt so vast, nor so cold. The morning following the confrontation at the manor, the air was crystalline, the frost on the windows thick enough to obscure the waking world outside. Hermione stood by the eastern alcove, her gaze fixed on the mahogany pedestal. The silver-tipped rose sat within its runic vacuum, a silent, mocking witness to a decade of stagnation. She had not slept. Her eyes were rimmed with a faint, bruised lavender, and the silk of her ivory blouse felt like a heavy shroud against her skin. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the glass. The atmospheric pressure in the room was brittle, a tense, glass-like silence that threatened to shatter at the slightest vibration. She knew he would come. She had sent the official summons an hour after dawn, not a request, but a ministerial mandate. The heavy oak doors groaned on their hinges as they swung open. Hermione didn't turn around, but she felt the shift in the room's static immediately. The scent of cedar and ozone drifted toward her, followed by the slow, rhythmic click of a cane against the stone floor. "You summoned me, Minister," Draco said. His voice was a hollow echo of its former self, stripped of its biting wit and reduced to a flat, deadened professional cadence. Hermione finally turned. Draco looked as though he had been carved from salt. His charcoal robes were immaculate, but his face was a pale, gaunt mask of exhaustion. The skin around his eyes was tight, and the way he gripped his silver cane suggested he was using it for more than just a shield. He was leaning on it as if his very bones had turned to lead. "I did," Hermione said, her voice steady despite the frantic thudding in her chest. She stepped away from the alcove, moving to stand in the center of the room. The distance between them was a chasm filled with the ghosts of the previous night's desperation. "I summoned you to discuss the finality of your resignation from the inspection department." Draco's eyes flickered, a momentary spark of confusion breaking through the ice. "I haven't submitted a resignation." "You did," she countered, her voice dropping to a fierce, low register. "The moment you told me you were choosing my survival over our truth. The moment you decided that being a Malfoy was a more permanent sentence than being the man who grew that garden. You resigned from the living, Draco, and I won't have a ghost running my departments." The muscle in Draco's jaw feathered, a sharp, rhythmic tick that betrayed the visceral alignment of his anger. He took a step forward, the silver signet ring flashing in the pale morning light. "This is not a game of semantics, Hermione. I told you." "I don't care what you told me," she snapped, the sudden heat of her voice slicing through the frigid air. The lumos orbs overhead flared in response to her surge of magic. "You think you're being noble. You think you're protecting my career. You're hiding. You're using your guilt as a fortress because you're too terrified to see what happens if you actually step out into the sun with me." She moved back to the alcove, her hand closing around the cool, smooth surface of the glass flask. You gave me this, she whispered, her fingers tracing the runes that kept the rose in its eternal stasis. And for 10 years, I kept it behind glass. I kept us behind glass, safe, untouched, dead. Draco's breath hitched, a jagged sound that filled the tense silence. It was the only way it could survive. The moment that rose touches the air, it dies. You know that. It's a metaphor for everything I am, Hermione. I can only exist in the shadows under a bell jar. If you bring me out into your world, I will wither, and I will take you with me. Then let it die, Hermione said. The words were a vow. Before Draco could move, before he could find the breath to protest, Hermione's fingers tightened. She didn't use a spell. She used the raw, physical strength of her conviction. She slammed the base of the flask against the edge of the mahogany pedestal. The sound of shattering glass was deafening, a sharp, crystalline explosion that echoed off the high-vaulted ceiling. Shards of enchanted crystal sprayed across the floor like diamonds, sparkling in the morning light. The runic wards flickered and died. The vacuum was broken. Draco let out a strangled cry, his cane clattering to the floor as he lunged forward, his hands reaching out as if to catch the invisible air. He stopped inches from the pedestal, his eyes wide with a horrified, visceral panic. The silver-tipped rose stood exposed. For the first time in a decade, the charcoal petals were touched by the oxygen of the room. The scent hit them both instantly. A concentrated, overwhelming burst of summer and old magic, the same perfume that had filled the Malfoy conservatory. They both watched, paralyzed, as the rose reacted to the world. It didn't immediately turn to ash. Instead, the silver edges of the petals began to glow with a soft, pulsing luminescence. The flower swayed slightly, as if breathing for the first time. It was fragile. Yes, it was vulnerable, but it was real. "Look at it," Hermione whispered, her hand bleeding from a tiny nick from the glass, a single drop of crimson staining her ivory cuff. "It's not rotting, Draco. It's just living. It's risking the end for the sake of the beginning." Draco's gaze shifted from the rose to Hermione's hand. He saw the drop of blood, the visceral proof of her reality. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted entirely, the magnetic pull becoming a physical weight that dragged him toward her. The ice in his eyes didn't just melt, it shattered, leaving behind a raw, pulsing warmth that he could no longer fight. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the smudge of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the fierce set of her jaw, and the way she was trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer force of her hope. "You broke it," he rasped, his voice a ruined, beautiful wreck. "I freed it," she corrected. "And I'm freeing you. I don't want the minister's career if it means I have to look at a glass jar every day to remember what love feels like. I want the man who grew the forest. I want the man who is brave enough to stay." The tactile friction between them reached a breaking point. The space between them, once a chasm of prejudice and doubt, vanished. Draco didn't hesitate this time. He didn't think about his father, or the prophet, or the stains on his soul. He moved with a sudden, desperate grace, his hands coming up to cup her face with a frantic, possessive heat. The contact was a cataclysm. His palms were burning against her skin, the silver ring a cold, hard anchor against her temple. Hermione's hands flew to his waist, her fingers digging into the heavy wool of his robes, pulling him closer until there was no air left between them. I'm a fool, Draco whispered against her forehead, his eyes closing as he breathed her in, the scent of parchment, rain, and the wild, defiant rose. I have been a fool for 10 years. Then stop, she murmured, her breath ghosting over his lips. Just be here. Now. He didn't answer with words. He lowered his head, his lips hovering a fraction of an inch from hers, the anticipation a stinging electric static that made the very air hum. The final barrier of his internal guilt was gone, dismantled by the sight of the shattered glass and the woman who had dared to break it. He leaned in, and as the world outside the windows continued its cold, indifferent march, the two of them stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the ruins of their own defenses, waiting for the final shift to take hold. The silence that followed the shattering of the glass was not empty. It was a living, breathing thing, heavy with the scent of a decade-old magic finally touching the air. Draco's hands, cupping Hermione's face, were no longer trembling with the frantic uncertainty of the archives or the desperate fear of the conservatory. They were steady, a grounding force that seemed to anchor her to the very stone of the ministry floor. He looked down at her, his storm-cloud eyes swimming with a raw, liquid silver. The aristocratic mask had not just slipped, it had been pulverized along with the flask. In its place was a man stripped of his titles, his lineage, and his carefully cultivated bitterness. You always were the most dangerous thing in this building, Granger, he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated against her skin. Destroying my defenses with a single blow. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've made a choice, Hermione replied, her voice ringing with a fierce, unyielding clarity. She reached up, her fingers sliding into the cool, silk-soft hair at his temples, pulling him closer until their foreheads were locked together. I've chosen the rose over the glass. I've chosen the man over the shadow. And I'm not going to let you retreat again, Draco. Not into your guilt, and certainly not into that manner. Draco let out a jagged, hitching breath, a sound that was half laugh and half sob. The magnetic pull between them, which had been a stinging static for so long, finally resolved into a deep, resonant hum of visceral alignment. The atmospheric pressure in the room peaked, the very molecules of the air charging with the heat of their proximity. I have spent 10 years trying to convince myself that I hated the way you looked at me, Draco murmured, his thumbs ghosting over her cheekbones, tracing the faint, bruised shadows of her exhaustion. But the truth is, I was just terrified that if I looked back, I'd never be able to look away again. He didn't wait for her to answer. The tension that had defined their lives, the approach and repulsion, the warmth and the freezing distance, finally collapsed. Draco leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not the gentle, tentative thing of a fairy tale. It was a cataclysmic collision of two starving souls. It tasted of salt, of the metallic tang of ozone, and of the heady, intoxicating perfume of the silver-tipped rose. It was a desperate, searching contact, a decade of suppressed longing exploding into a physical reality that left Hermione breathless. She molded her body against his, her hands clutching at the charcoal wool of his robes, pulling him into her space as if she could pull him into her very soul. Draco groaned against her mouth, a low, visceral sound of surrender. His arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly off her feet, his grip possessive and unyielding. The bite of his silver signet ring pressed into the small of her back, a cold spark against the burning heat of their embrace. In that kiss, the Ministry of Magic ceased to exist. The Daily Prophet, the Wizengamot, the looming shadow of Lucius Malfoy, all of it was incinerated in the white-hot fire of their shared truth. There was only the friction of his lips, the frantic thud of his heart against her ribs, and the overwhelming scent of a summer that would never end. When they finally broke apart, they were both gasping for air, their pulses visible in the hollows of their throats. Draco didn't let her go. He tucked her head beneath his chin, his cheek resting against the top of her hair, his chest heaving. "I'm ruined," he whispered into her curls, though there was a strange soaring lightness in his tone that belied the word. "The head of inspection compromised by the minister. My reputation won't survive the afternoon." "Then we'll build a new one," Hermione said, pulling back just enough to look up at him. She reached out, her thumb catching a stray tear that had escaped his eye, a silver track on his pale skin. "Together. We'll start with the roses." 3 weeks later, the frost had retreated, replaced by a soft, misty spring that clung to the Wiltshire countryside. The iron gates of Malfoy Manor stood wide open, no longer a barrier, but an invitation. The great conservatory was flooded with the golden light of a late afternoon sun. The air was warm and hummed with the gentle drone of charmed bees. Hermione stood at the edge of the rose beds, her sleeves rolled up, her hands dusted with the dark, rich soil of the estate. She wasn't alone. Draco was beside her, kneeling in the moss. He had traded his severe black robes for a simple linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. He was carefully transplanting a young silver-tipped rose into a new ceramic pot, a cutting from the original flower that had once sat in the minister's office. The atmosphere between them had shifted from the frantic, electric static of the ministry to a steady, enduring warmth. The tactical friction was still there, the way their shoulders brushed as they worked, the long, lingering looks that required no words. But the bite of the cold was gone. "You're doing it wrong," Draco remarked, a familiar, playful drawl returning to his voice. He reached over, his hand covering hers as she tried to pat down the soil. "You have to be gentle with the roots, Hermione. They've spent too long in the dark. They need time to trust the light." Hermione smiled, a genuine, radiant thing that reached her eyes. She turned her hand beneath his, interlacing their fingers. The silver signet ring was still there, but it no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a promise. "I think I'm beginning to understand that," she murmured. Draco pulled her toward him, his movement fluid and easy. He sat back on his heels, drawing her into the circle of his arms. The scent of the garden was all-encompassing, earth, sun, and the sweet metallic perfume of the roses. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over hers in a slow, lingering kiss that tasted of peace and new beginnings. It was a soft contact, a quiet affirmation of the life they were building in the ruins of their past. "I spoke to the committee this morning," Hermione whispered against his lips as they broke apart. "The audit reforms have been passed. The inspection department is officially autonomous." Draco hummed, his nose brushing against hers. "And the minister. How is her approval rating now that she's been seen frequenting the home of a disgraced aristocrat?" "Scandalous," she teased, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "The prophet calls it a dangerous liaison." Rita Skeeter is practically foaming at the mouth. Draco chuckled, a deep, rich sound that echoed through the glass house. He leaned in again, his kiss deeper this time, more certain. He tasted of the tea they had shared that morning and the crisp, clean air of the manor grounds. It was a kiss that spoke of long nights in the archives, of whispered truths in the rain, and of a devotion that had finally found its home. As the sun began to set, casting long amber shadows across the sea of silver-tipped roses, the two of them stayed there, lost in the quiet intimacy of their shared garden. The glass flask was gone, shattered and forgotten, and in its place was a forest of hope that would never wither. The rose that gave hope had done more than just survive. It had bloomed into a future where the shadows were finally held at bay by the light of two people who had refused to let go. "I love you, Draco," Hermione whispered into the twilight. Draco tightened his hold on her, his eyes closing as he pressed a final reverent kiss to her temple. "I have loved you since that corridor, Hermione," he replied, his voice a steady anchor in the darkening room. "I was just waiting for you to break the glass." The silence of the manor was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary filled with the soft rustle of leaves and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a love that had finally, irrevocably, found its way out of the dark. The air in the atrium of the Ministry of Magic was thick with the scent of wet wool, old stone, and the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety. It was barely 8 o'clock in the morning, but the hall was already packed. The golden fountain of magical brethren had been cordoned off, and a swarm of journalists from the Daily Prophet and the Witch Weekly hovered like vultures near the elevators. The flash of camera bulbs was a rhythmic, punishing strobe light, turning the world into a series of jagged black and white snapshots. Hermione Granger stood in the shadows of the secondary entrance, her fingers digging into the velvet lining of her pockets. Her knuckles were white, the skin stretched tight over the bone. The news had broken with the force of a tidal wave. Photographs of her entering Malfoy Manor, testimonies of their late-night meetings, and a particularly vitriolic editorial suggesting that the Minister for Magic had been compromised by the very family she once fought to bring to justice. She felt the atmospheric pressure in the corridor drop. A familiar, cold ozone scent cut through the musk of the crowd. Draco was there. He didn't say a word. He stepped out of the gloom, his black robes as sharp as a blade, his silver-topped cane clicking softly against the floor. He looked as though he had been carved from winter itself, impassive, aristocratic, and terrifyingly remote. But as he drew level with her, his hand ghosted near hers. He didn't take it, not yet, not in the open, but the magnetic pull between them was a roar of static in the small space. The heat radiating from him was a physical shield, a visceral alignment that braced her against the storm outside. "They're calling for a vote of no confidence, Draco," Hermione whispered, her voice a thin thread of silk in the dark. "The traditionalist factions have combined with the skeptics. They say my judgment is clouded. They say I've allowed a Death Eater's heir to audit our democracy." Draco's jaw ticked, a sharp, rhythmic pulse of tension. He turned his head slightly, his storm cloud eyes catching the dim light. The ice she had seen so many times was present, but beneath it was a raw, pulsing vulnerability that only she was allowed to witness. "Let them call it," Draco rasped. His voice was a low, dangerous vibration. I have spent my entire adult life preparing for this moment, Hermione. I have documented every audit, every sickle, every minute of my service. If they want to put your judgment on trial, they'll have to go through the integrity of my department first. And I promise you, my ledgers are cleaner than their consciences. He reached out then, his long, pale fingers brushing against her wrist, just beneath the cuff of her blouse. The tactile friction was an electric shock, a grounding force that stopped the world from spinning. The bite of his silver signet ring was a cold anchor against her skin. "Don't hide me," he said, his gaze locking onto hers with a desperate, fierce intensity. "Don't try to protect my reputation to save yours. Today we break the glass entirely. We show them the rose, or we let it wither. There is no middle ground left." Hermione nodded, her throat tight. She straightened her spine, smoothing the front of her deep plum robes, the colour of authority, of power. She stepped out into the atrium, and the roar of the crowd hit her like a physical blow. The Wizengamot chamber was a theatre of judgment. Hundreds of witches and wizards in plum-coloured robes sat in tiered rows, their faces obscured by the shadows of the high, vaulted ceiling. In the centre of the room, under the harsh, clinical light of a dozen lumos orbs, stood 2 chairs. Hermione took her seat as minister. Draco took his as head of inspection. The proceedings were a blur of accusations. Tiberius Ogden, a man whose family had thrived under the old regime and chafed under Hermione's reforms, led the charge. He spoke of conflicts of interest, of familial manipulation, and of the integrity of the ministry being auctioned off in the drawing rooms of Wiltshire. Hermione felt the coldness rising in her chest, a defensive repulsion. She looked at the faces in the crowd, people she had worked with for years, people who were now looking at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. The atmospheric pressure in the chamber was suffocating, a heavy, airless weight that made it hard to breathe. Then Draco stood up. He didn't wait to be addressed. He moved to the centre of the floor, his cane abandoned on his chair. He stood before the Wizengamot without a shield, his hands empty, his posture radiating a terrifying, quiet power. "You speak of shadows," Draco began, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room without the aid of a sonorous charm. It was a smooth, lethal drawl that commanded absolute silence. "You speak of a Death Eater's heir, as if the blood in my veins is a ledger of my crimes. You suggest that the Minister for Magic has been compromised by a ghost." He reached into the air, and with a flick of his wand, thousands of shimmering, translucent sheets of parchment began to rain down from the ceiling. They were copies of his audit reports, the raw data of 10 years of service. "Look at them," Draco commanded. "Look at the sanctions I have placed on Malfoy interests. Look at the transparency I have demanded from my own father's former associates. I have been more ruthless with my own name than any of you would ever dare to be with yours." He turned, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on Ogden. "You don't fear that I am manipulating the minister," Draco said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "You fear that I am not. You fear that the two of us working together will finally shine a light into the corners where you've been hiding your own prejudices for decades. You fear the truth of our alignment because it renders your hatred obsolete." The room was so silent that Hermione could hear the frantic, uneven thud of her own heart. The static in the air was humming, a magnetic pull so strong it felt as though the very stones of the ministry were vibrating. "I am a Malfoy," Draco said, and for the first time he didn't say it with shame. He said it with the weight of a man who had reclaimed his own story. "I was raised in the dark. I have seen the rot, and because I have seen it, I am the only one qualified to protect this ministry from it. If you want to strip the minister of her title because she chose to trust the man I have become, then you are not fit to sit in these chairs." He turned then, and for the first time in front of the world, he looked directly at Hermione. The ice in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, pulsing warmth that was so intense it felt like a physical touch. He wasn't looking at the minister. He was looking at the woman who had broken the glass. He was looking at his anchor, his hope, his everything. Hermione felt the shift in the room. The tide of public opinion, so fickle and cruel, began to turn. The people in the rows weren't looking at a scandal anymore. They were looking at a revolution. They were looking at two people who had refused to let the past dictate the future. Ogden tried to speak, but the murmurs of the crowd drowned him out. The chief warlock banged his gavel, but the sound was hollow, a dying echo of a power that was no longer absolute. "The motion for a vote of no confidence," the chief warlock announced, his voice wavering, "is withdrawn for lack of standing." A cheer, hesitant at first and then deafening, erupted from the gallery. But Hermione didn't hear it. She was already standing, her robes billowing as she descended the stairs to the floor. She met Draco in the center of the room, under the dying light of the Lumos orbs. The atmospheric pressure had cleared, leaving behind a crisp, clean air that tasted of victory and ozone. Draco didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about the Wizengamot or the journalists or the ghosts of his ancestors. He reached out, his long, pale fingers closing around Hermione's hand. He pulled her flush against him, the visceral impact of their bodies meeting sending a jolt through them both. "You were brilliant," she whispered, her voice cracking with the sheer force of her relief. "I was honest," Draco replied, his forehead coming to rest against hers. The scent of him, cedar, bergamot, and that faint, persistent trace of the silver rose, enveloped her, a velvet shroud of safety. "There's a difference." He leaned down then, his lips ghosting over hers in a brief, agonizingly sweet contact that was seen by every person in the room. It wasn't a kiss of triumph. It was a kiss of surrender. A public declaration that the glass was gone and that they were finally, irrevocably living in the open air. The tactile friction of his lips against hers was a promise of a future that no one could take away. The magnetic pull was no longer a secret burden. It was a visible bond, a bridge built of silver petals and unyielding iron. "Let's go home, Draco," Hermione murmured against his skin. "To the manor?" he asked, a trace of the old playful drawl returning to his voice. "To the garden," she corrected. "I want to see the sun on the roses." As they walked out of the chamber, hand in hand, the flashbulbs continued to pop, but the light didn't feel like a punishment anymore. It felt like the dawn. The world was still complicated, and the shadows would always try to return. But as Hermione felt the bite of Draco's silver ring against her hand, she knew that the rose that gave hope would never wither again. The sun was sinking into the jagged horizon of the Wiltshire Hills, bleeding a deep, bruised violet and liquid gold across the sprawling estate of Malfoy Manor. It was an evening of profound, heavy stillness. The kind of silence that felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final transition from light into shadow. The air was cool, carrying the crisp scent of damp grass and the distant metallic tang of the stone fountain. But within the high glass walls of the great conservatory, the world remained a tropical, humid sanctuary. Hermione walked down the moss-covered path, the hem of her silk robes whispering against the verdant floor. She had discarded the heavy, plum-coloured vestments of her office in the manor's foyer, appearing now in a simple, cream-coloured dress that caught the dying amber light. The atmospheric pressure in the greenhouse was thick, saturated with the intoxicating velvet perfume of thousands of silver-tipped roses. At the centre of the garden, standing beneath the arched ribs of the crystal ceiling, was Draco. He had changed into a soft, dark linen shirt, the sleeves unbuttoned and pushed back to his elbows. He wasn't working. He was simply standing there, his back to her, looking out at the sea of charcoal and silver petals he had spent a decade conjuring from his own loneliness. The rigid, defensive posture that had defined him for years was gone. His shoulders were relaxed, and his head was tilted slightly back, as if he were finally drinking in the oxygen of a world that no longer demanded he hide. Hermione stopped a few paces behind him. The magnetic pull between them, now liberated from the sterile halls of the ministry and the judgmental eyes of the Wizengamot, was a low, resonant thrum in her blood. It was a visceral alignment that required no spells, a gravity that had finally, irrevocably, brought them into the same orbit. The prophet is calling it the restoration of the rose, she said softly, her voice skipping over the humid air. Draco didn't turn immediately, but she saw the slight, rhythmic tick of his jaw, a lingering shadow of the man who had fought so hard to remain untouchable. They're looking for a fairy tale, Hermione. They want to believe that a few speeches in a courtroom can wash away the soot of 20 years. Maybe they just want to believe in something that isn't broken, she countered, stepping closer. The tactile friction of the air between them grew warm, a humming static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Maybe they're right to. Draco finally turned. The amber light of the sunset caught the sharp, elegant planes of his face, illuminating the silver grey of his eyes. The ice was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, pulsing warmth that made Hermione's breath catch in her throat. He looked at her with a starving, desperate intensity, a look that acknowledged every doubt, every fear, and every mile of the long, jagged road they had travelled to reach this silence. "I don't care what they believe," he rasped, his voice a ruined, beautiful wreck of silk and gravel. He reached out, his long, pale fingers ghosting through the air before finally settling on her waist. The contact was an explosion. The heat of his palms seared through the thin fabric of her dress, a jolt of pure, unadulterated magic that bypassed her logic and went straight to her core. Hermione let out a shaky, uneven breath, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. She felt the frantic, heavy thud of his heart beneath the linen, a rapid, syncopated rhythm that matched her own. "I only care that you're here," he whispered, his head bowing until his forehead rested against hers. "I only care that when I woke up this morning, I didn't have to look at a glass flask to know that you existed." He pulled her flush against him, his arms wrapping around her with a sudden possessive strength. The visceral impact of their bodies meeting sent a wave of heat through the conservatory, the magical flowers around them swaying as if caught in a phantom breeze. Hermione buried her face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of him, cedar, sharp ozone, and the deep floral musk of the sanctuary. "I'm not going anywhere, Draco," she murmured against his skin. "The glass is shattered. There's no way to put the pieces back together." Draco pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. His thumb traced the line of her lower lip, his touch agonizingly slow, a tactile exploration of a reality he still seemed to fear might vanish. The bite of his silver signet ring was a cool, hard anchor against her jaw. "Show me," he breathed. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. Hermione reached up, her fingers interlacing behind his neck, pulling his head down. When their lips finally met, it wasn't the desperate public declaration of the courtroom. This was a slow, sensual surrender, a deep, searching kiss that tasted of the years they had lost and the lifetime they had gained. It was a tactile friction of tongues and teeth, a rhythmic, velvet pressure that made the world outside the glass walls dissolve into nothingness. Draco groaned, a low, visceral sound of release that vibrated through her entire frame. His hands slid down to the small of her back, his fingers digging into the silk of her dress, urging her closer until there was no air, no space, no past left between them. He kissed her as if he were trying to memorize the texture of her soul, his lips moving over hers with an unhurried, agonizingly thorough devotion. The atmospheric pressure in the greenhouse peaked. The floating moon spheres above them began to glow with a brilliant, pulsing silver, reflecting the sheer intensity of the magic blooming between them. The silver-tipped roses seemed to lean toward them, their petals shimmering in the twilight, as if acknowledging the master of the garden had finally found his son. Draco broke the kiss, only to trail his lips down her jaw, his breath hot against the sensitive skin of her neck. Hermione's head fell back, her eyes fluttering shut as a shiver of pure electric pleasure raced down her spine. The scent of the roses was all-encompassing now, a heavy, intoxicating shroud that blurred the lines of her identity. She wasn't the minister. She wasn't the war hero. She was simply a woman who had found her anchor in the middle of a storm. "Stay," Draco whispered against the pulse point of her throat, his voice a jagged, broken thread. "Stay in the garden. Stay with me. I don't want a world without the scent of you on the air." "I'm staying," she promised, her fingers tightening in his hair, pulling him back to her lips. The second kiss was even deeper, a visceral alignment of two souls who had spent a decade pretending they didn't need the other to breathe. It was a slow burn that had finally caught fire, a quiet revolution of touch and heat. Draco's hands moved with a newfound certainty, tracing the curves of her body with a reverence that made Hermione feel as though she were the most precious artifact in his collection. Not a trophy to be kept behind glass, but a living, breathing miracle to be cherished in the open air. As the final sliver of the sun vanished, leaving the conservatory bathed in the ethereal, silvery glow of the moon spheres, they stood together in the center of their secret forest. The tension that had defined their lives, the approach and repulsion, the cold and the heat, had finally resolved into a steady, enduring warmth. Draco pulled back at last, his eyes dark and liquid with a love he no longer tried to hide. He reached out and plucked a single silver-tipped rose from the bed beside them. He didn't give it to her this time. He tucked it behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her skin. "The rose that gave hope," he murmured, his thumb ghosting over her cheek. "No," Hermione corrected, a soft, radiant smile touching her lips. She reached up and took his hand, pressing a kiss to the silver signet ring on his finger. "The rose that gave us a home." They walked out of the conservatory hand in hand, leaving the scent of the summer behind them. As they crossed the stone terrace toward the manor, the heavy iron gates remained open to the stars, a symbol of a legacy that had been reclaimed and a future that was finally, irrevocably theirs. The shadows of Malfoy Manor were still there, but as Draco pulled Hermione into the warmth of the foyer, the light they carried between them was more than enough to hold the dark at bay. The silver-tipped rose in her hair caught the starlight, a tiny glowing beacon of a love that had survived the vacuum and learned to thrive in the wild, beautiful and unpredictable air.
Thank you for staying me until the end. This story is about more than just magic. It is about the walls we build around our hearts. We all have glass jars. We keep our secrets, our fears, and our old pains inside them. We think we are safe behind the glass, but we are only frozen. Draco and Hermione showed us something important. To truly live, you must be brave. You must be willing to break the glass. Yes, it's scary. Yes, it might hurt. But the air, the open air, is where we finally breathe. I hope this story reminded you that people can change. Love is not a straight line. It is a slow pull. It is a choice we make every day to stay in the light. In your own life, don't be afraid to let your rose touch the air. The best things in the life are the ones we risk everything for. Thank you for listening. Love always wins.